Hello and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to episode 6 of NCERT International Relations. Today's session is probably the most important session amongst all the 16 classes that we have planned under the NCERT IR series. Why is this the most important session? That's because we are going to cover the India China relations with specific focus on the 1962 war and the boundary disputes between India and China. See, India China relationship is quite difficult for a beginner to understand. It is a complex relationship, it is largely misunderstood as well. There exists a lot of stereotypes, and China is often branded as India's enemy number one. In fact, more serious threat than Pakistan. While true to some extent, it is very important to understand why this relationship has become this way. Why is there so much hostility between the two countries? What is the entire background of the border dispute? And what are the current challenges that we are facing? So, that is something we'll try to break down in today's session. I'll take you beyond the NCRT books and we will carry out a detailed assessment of the 1962 war and the events leading up to the 1962 war. We'll also need to understand the entire spectrum of the boundary issues that we have between us and what are the recent developments in this regard. So it's going to be a detailed class as I promised. But before we begin, please note that as part of the NCERT course, every Thursday and Friday at 3 p.m., I'm conducting a quiz on the Unacademy app. Last week, we already had two sessions based on what we have covered in these NCERT classes. And since the course will continue till 31st August, every Thursday, Friday of August, we will continue to have these free quiz sessions that are scheduled on the Unacademy app. If you go to my profile, you can find these classes scheduled under the free classes section. Or else, just scan the QR code on your screen and you will be able to access all the links in one place. Now, what will you get by attending these free quiz sessions? One, it'll help you revise these topics. It'll help you practice prelims level questions. And more importantly, on 31st August, we will conduct an NCERT mega quiz for international relations, where you will get 50 questions to practice. And those of you who perform well, you stand a chance to get up to 20% additional discount on Unacademy Platinum subscription. Under Unacademy Platinum, we provide a seamless two-way interaction between the educator and the students, where students have to mandatorily keep their cameras on. It blends the online and the offline experience, providing greater accountability, ensuring that the teachers can maintain better connect with the students. So you will get a 20% additional discount on Unacademy Platinum subscription. So please note the mega quiz will happen on 31st August from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. on the Unacademy app. And for the PDF of the session, please scan the QR code and I'll be sharing the PDF over here by tomorrow. And all the links that we have mentioned, they're also provided in the video description as well. Now let's come back to our discussion and let's focus on the background of India-China relations. I was telling you that the India-China relationship is vastly misunderstood on both the sides. Generally, Indians have a very limited and poor understanding of what China is. And vice versa, even the Chinese have a very poor understanding of what India is. So when you don't understand each other, when these are the two big powers, two rising global powers, naturally differences will easily turn into conflict. So, one way to avoid the mistrust, the miscommunication, is to build the bonds. Look at the historical ties that have bound the great Indian and the Chinese civilizations. See, NCRT makes a very incorrect assumption in the class 12 textbook. In the contemporary world politics book, there is a section on India China relations, on the contemporary relations, where the NCRT book is arguing that India China don't understand each other from a historical perspective. But that's not entirely correct. Though it is true in the modern times that we have a poor understanding of each other, historically, we actually had a flourishing relationship that goes back to ancient and medieval times. If you look at the ancient Silk Road, the trade route that linked the two great civilizations, the trade of, let's say, Indian ivory to China or Chinese silk to India, for example. and how religious cultural exchanges used to take place thousands of years ago. This civilizational relationship is at least more than 2000 years old. Today, India and China may not understand each other well, but that was not always the case. Buddhism traveled from India to China and spread across Southeast and East Asia as well, forming a living cultural bond that exists even today. Look at travelers like Huan Sang, who documented ancient and medieval India, took back the accounts, and played a very big role in the further spread of Indian cultural influence in the then Chinese civilization. Or the legendary Bodhidharma, who is said to have traveled from India to China, laying the roots for martial arts and Buddhism. So all these historical connections, they are a reminder that the two nation states today, they actually share a historical relationship, a civilizational relationship. Even our great epics like Mahabharata contain references to the land of China. Even the Arthashastra by Kautilya contains references with regard to China. Though it does not talk much about India China relations as such, it does mention Chinese silk and the trade and cultural linkages, which points towards some sort of interaction that would have existed back in those days. Then look at the Tamil dynasties, the Pallavas and the Cholas, and what they achieved. It was quite remarkable. If you look at the influence and the connect that Pallavas and Cholas maintained, it actually offers key lessons to manage the India China relations in today's times as well. Look at Nalanda, one of the oldest centers of learning located in today's Bihar. Was a, it was a melting pot for scholars, academics, students from across Asia region, from today's Japan and China to South Korea to Southeast Asia, where Buddhist monks and other scholars would arrive at Nalanda, forming a direct linkage, a cultural, academic, educational linkage. Now, when you look at the historical ties, especially with regard to southern parts of India and China, primarily the maritime links that existed, it's quite phenomenal to even realize that those connections existed back in that era. When you look at the Pallavas, right, who were centered around Kanchipuram, which is in close proximity to Mamlapuram or Mahabalipuram, which was a thriving port for the Pallava dynasty. Through Mamlapuram, the Pallavas maintained a connection with the Tang Empire in China. They built a working diplomatic relationship focused on military and security partnership, focused on strategic ties, religious exchange. And those signs can be found even today in coastal Tamil Nadu, where Chinese scholars, Chinese traders would be found near Mamalapuram. And similarly, Tamil traders extended their influence into the Chinese empire. No wonder the India China summit that took place, where Prime Minister Modi hosted Xi Jinping in 2019, the summit was held at Mamlapuram. It was a symbolic gesture from the Indian side to bring back the age old connection that was formed by the Pallavas and the Tang Empire in China, especially from 4th to 9th century. This was a flourishing relationship focused on diplomatic ties, trade, military relations, strategic relations, and cultural and religious exchange as well. Then look at the Cholas, especially from 9th, 10th century onwards, as Cholas rose as a maritime power. They defeated the Srivijaya Empire in today's Indonesia and spread their influence across the Southeast Asia region, from today's Myanmar, Thailand, all the way towards Malaysia and Indonesia. So the Cholas, who were predominantly a maritime naval power, they established a flourishing maritime trade relationship with the Song dynasty in China, focusing on Tamil merchants, linking with Southeast Asian region via the Malacca Strait, reaching out into South China Sea, into China, carrying precious goods and building a formidable diplomatic relationship. In fact, historical records, they show the naval and military cooperation also that existed between the Cholas and the Song dynasty. For example, near Malacca Strait, piracy was a major threat for the commercial ships that were carrying goods. So, to tackle piracy, the Cholas collaborated with the Song dynasty. They even shared shipbuilding and naval technology with each other. Now, that is exactly how a modern day diplomatic relationship looks like. And something like this existed hundreds of years ago. When you go to Kerala, for example, you see the Chinese fishing nets, which is a clear Chinese cultural export, right? So there are many such linkages that bind the two nations and the two people even today. If you go to Taiwan, there is a very famous temple, the Sun Moon Temple at the Sun Moon Lake, where you have a mural of Huan Sang and his travel across India. And it depicts the origin of Buddhism from the Indian subcontinent and how it traveled to China. So you have such symbols even today, right? Historical symbols, cultural symbols that bind the two nations. And there's no reason why we can't understand each other better. See, today's misunderstanding is largely a result of the hostility that has developed since 1949, 1950. The developments of 1950s and 60s has contributed to the negative perception of each other. Both sides have a differing perception of what the other side thinks. And also modern China, the way it has been built politically, based on communism by Mao Zedong, which is built on an extremist left-wing ideology, is primarily at the heart of the mistrust that exists. Because today's China, the PRC, the People's Republic of China, it definitely has expansionist intentions. It has territorial intentions. And that is what you need to understand. Why is China such an aggressive power today? You might have heard of China's wolf warrior diplomacy, how Xi Jinping has urged his diplomats and intelligence officers to be as aggressive as possible while dealing with other countries. And look at how China picks territorial disputes with everyone, with almost every neighbor. China has had some or the other territorial dispute. Even with a friendly country like Russia. China Russia used to have differences. During the Cold War, in the 60s and 70s period, the Soviet Union and China had fallen apart. A big divide had come up between them, though both were communist nations. Look at how China picks boundary disputes with India, with Bhutan, which we studied in the previous class. Or look at Chinese aggression in South China Sea and East China Sea. How it has claimed the exclusive economic zone and the island territories belonging to Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and Japan as well. Or look at Chinese aggression when it comes to the question of Tibet, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and especially Taiwan. China keeps reiterating that Taiwan will be occupied and reunified with mainland China. China even appears to be making preparations, military preparations, to possibly carry out an invasion of Taiwan someday. Many experts believe that in the next few years, we might likely see a Chinese attempt to occupy Taiwan. So, what makes today's China so aggressive? Why is it so territorial? Why is it so untrustworthy as a neighboring country? Why does it have disputes with almost every country? To understand that, we again have to find answers in history. We need to look at the origin of the PRC and the Communist Party of China. The ideology of Maoism, which is the foundational ideology of the PRC, is something you need to understand in slight detail. Some of you might think we have deviated from the topic, but trust me, to understand India-China boundary dispute and the 1962 war, the background of China is extremely important. So before we talk about all these important details, I have a very important announcement. Those of you who are preparing for 2027 and beyond, and if you're looking to enroll with us, Unacademy is now offering our subscription at the lowest price ever as we mark the Independence Day celebrations. On popular demand, the offer period has been extended till 19th August, and you can now avail the subscription at just 16,999. And 80 lucky learners will get a 100% refund as we mark the 80th Independence Day of India. Along with that, you also get added benefits. For example, you get free extension. If you avail a 15-month subscription, you get 3-month free extension. If you avail a 24-month subscription, you get a 12-month free extension. And if you subscribe to 2 years and above, if you fulfill this criteria, you will also get CSE Assure Guarantee and as well as subscription to Indian Express. Under CSE Assure Guarantee, let's say for some reason you don't clear the exam in your first attempt, despite your best efforts, then we will provide the next attempt absolutely free. We'll extend your subscription so that your preparation doesn't take a hit. And along with that, you will get access to Indian Express subscription, which will give you access to the premium research articles, explained section, and UPSC essential segment of Indian Express. This subscription alone would cost you 1500, and this would be a part of your Unacademy subscription if you avail a 2-year subscription and above. So those of you who don't want to miss out on all these offers, enroll within the offer period by 19th August, and please ensure you use the code IAS English. The link is provided in the description below, and by entering IAS English as the code, it'll ensure that you will get the discount as well with the benefits. Plus, you'll be directed towards the English medium classes where you'll be taught by India's leading educators in English medium. So with this, let's come back to our discussion and let's talk about the evolution of modern China, the establishment of the PRC. So to talk about the PRC, first we have to understand the Chinese Civil War that lasted from 1927 to 1949. See, when you look at China's history, for centuries it has been ruled by some great empires like the Tang, the Song dynasty, and the last dynasty was the Qing dynasty that ruled over imperial China until 1912. In 1912, the Kuomintang Party, or the KMT, who are considered as the Chinese nationalists, led by Sun Yat-sen, they toppled the imperial regime. The Qing Empire was toppled, and the nationalists established the Republic of China, or the ROC. Now, this Chinese regime, which controlled some parts of China, right? It didn't have full control over Tibet and Xinjiang as it does today. It was mainly concentrated in eastern part of China. It took over from imperial China from the Qing dynasty, but the rule of the ROC, the Republic of China, it became widely unpopular, especially in the rural areas and amongst the masses. See, historically, China also has suffered primarily from external invasions and aggression in a very, very similar way to what India has gone through, primarily exploited by imperial fascist powers, colonial powers. I'm sure you guys would have read about the Opium Wars, how Britain and France exploited China during the opium peak seasons, right? And how the Opium Wars decimated the Chinese society, culture, and economy. So China also faced the brunt of colonial exploitation. Then Japan, Imperial Japan has committed brutal atrocities since 1800s during the World War period as well. So China had faced a lot of outside aggression, which had dented the Chinese pride and the Chinese economy. So in 1900s, when the nationalists, when they toppled the imperial regime of the Qing dynasty, they were supposed to address these pressing issues, to uplift the economy, to serve the masses, to serve the rural population, mainly the farmers, the peasants, the landless, improve the conditions of the workers in urban areas. But unfortunately, under Republic of China, there was a huge class divide that started emerging. The elites, they seemed to be not interested about focusing on governance, particularly in the remote areas, in the rural parts of China. So a lot of resentment, discontent had been growing. And this is where communism took root in China in 1921 with the establishment of the Communist Party of China. Communism, which had originated in the Eurasia region, primarily in Soviet Union, right? It spread towards China, and the Communist Party of China was established in 1921. In fact, recently, 2021, the CPC has celebrated its 100th anniversary. So the Communist Party, which was later headed by Mao Zedong or Mao Zedong, started promoting the ideals of a egalitarian and equality based society. It started representing the interests of the farmers, the peasants, landless workers, and as well as the industry workers in the urban centers. By then, China was already the most populous nation, with large scale poverty, a huge social divide. And in general, the Chinese masses felt that the glory of the Chinese civilization had been gone, it had been destroyed. And partly they blamed outside invasions and external interference from Japan, from Britain, France, etc. And they held the Republic of China to be directly responsible for failing to uplift the people and the economy. So the Communist Party exploited the sentiments and triggered a major conflict starting from 1927-28 onwards, where the communists they faced off with the KMT, the Kuomintang, that is the nationalist section of the Chinese, that is the Republic of China. Later on, the KMT was taken over by another legendary and famous leader, Chiang Kai-shek, after the demise of Sun Yat-sen. And as Mao Zedong was championing the Maoist cause, the communist cause, Chiang Kai-shek, as the leader of the one party under the one party system of the KMT, he continued to essentially crush any opponents. Right? The KMT regime was an authoritarian regime as well, a dictatorial regime, where there was no space for any different ideologies to flourish. So the nationalists under Republic of China targeted the communists, while the communists were building a strong base in the rural parts of China under the leadership of Mao Zedong. In fact, when the Republic of China started targeting the communists, they even tried to carry out the long march to retreat back into the rural areas to escape the state atrocities that were being committed. So, large scale fighting had broken out. A civil war like condition had already broken out by late 1920s. Then came the Second World War period, where Japan invaded China. Imperial fascist Japan carried out an invasion, occupying many parts of eastern China, including the Manchuria region. So, this Japanese invasion was brutal. Large scale killings were carried out. Even today, the Chinese hate the Japanese for this, for the brutal atrocities that the Japanese forces committed, from mass slaughter to rapes to a genocide being committed. So during this period, when China was under attack from Japan during Second World War, briefly the civil war came to a halt because all the forces united for a brief period. The KMT, which was running the Republic of China's government, a one party government, sought support from the communists. The civil war briefly halted at that point, and the Chinese fought back against the Japanese invasion. Now, look at the map here. It's very interesting. You can observe how China looked in 1941. What's interesting is that Tibet is not part of it, Xinjiang is not part of it. Though historically, Chinese empires had extended their territorial reach far beyond this, even towards Central Asia, right? But in modern times, with the Qing dynasty becoming weaker, it had lost control, right? Tibet had been an independent kingdom for several centuries. Xinjiang, which was more linked with the Turkestan region and the Central Asia region, and more linked with Islam, had completely moved away from China's sphere of influence. So during the Second World War period, China was a much smaller country than what it is today. In fact, what's even more interesting is that China would not share a direct border except for at the trijunction with Myanmar near the Yunnan province. There would be no direct borders between India and China at that point. So when India became independent in 1947, China was not one of the major neighbors of India. Today we share a 3,600 kilometer plus border, but that was not always the case, right? From 1947 to 1950, China was barely a neighboring country of India with a very small trijunction point being present where India, Myanmar meet the Yunnan province of China. Now you can see here how the communist control was very restricted and limited to few parts of eastern China, with the KMT largely in control and some territories being occupied by Japan, particularly in the Manchuria region. So during this war period, the Second World War period, the KMT sought the support of the communists as they fought back against the Japanese invasion. And briefly, the civil war had come to a halt. But once Japan was defeated, once the Second World War came to an end, immediately the civil war resumed between the communists and the nationalists. See, what makes Chinese communism much more dangerous is the ideology of Maoism. which in India is known as Naxalism, that took root in India much later in 1967. Maoism is built on one fundamental idea, which is to capture the state power through armed violence. Mao Zedong advocated to his cadres, to the Maoists who follow this form of left wing extremist ideology, to take up arms against the state and to topple corrupt states, mainly by building a mass mobilization, by engaging in a protracted war, by leveraging the local geography and terrain to their advantage. As local farmers, peasants, and workers, they would be better aware of the local terrain. To fight the state forces, Mao Zedong urged the Maoists to rely on guerrilla warfare tactics. He spelt out the strategy and the tactics to be followed by the Maoists. So, if you look at Maoism, in Maoism, taking up arms is non negotiable. Violence is inherent to this left wing extremist ideology. That's why Naxalism that took root in India later is a banned ideology, right? The Naxal outfits have been designated as terrorist organizations in India under the UAPA. That's because under the Maoist strand of left wing extremism, violence is non negotiable. Taking up arms against the state, to topple the state, to capture state power in order to form a future state, a future government. That is the core tenet of Maoism. So eventually, by 1949, the Maoists gained an upper hand. They managed to defeat the KMT. They managed to kick out the regime of Chiang Kai shek. And the nationalists, they fled China and they took refuge in today's Taiwan. The Kuomintang party, along with its leader, Chiang Kai shek, they shifted base to Taiwan. And that's the reason why Taiwan today is known as Republic of China. Whereas mainland China was completely brought under the Communist Party. You can see the advances of the Communist Party in this illustration over here. By 1949, the communists made a massive advance across different parts of China, very quickly expanding territorial control, toppling the then Chinese government, and throwing out the ROC into Taiwan, cornering them into Taiwan. So in mainland China, the CPC declared itself as the state. The party became the state, a one party rule. And with that, the PRC was born, the People's Republic of China, established by the People's Liberation Army under the Maoist ideology, inspired by Maoist extremism. So no wonder today's China, that is PRC, is inherently violent and aggressive. It believes in targeting any outside interference. Because see, the historical decline of the Chinese greatness, right? It brought a sense of insecurity amongst the Chinese. I mean, it's a social and cultural thing. With the collapse of their economy, with the exploitation of their society and economy by outside powers like Britain, France, and Japan, after decades of humiliation, in fact, the Chinese view at a century of humiliation. And Mao Zedong offered them a way out. He offered them this utopian view that under Maoism, China can become strong again. China can revive that lost glory of the Chinese empires. China can rebuild its economy, its technological military prowess, and expand its territory to resemble the great Chinese empires of that era. So inherently, the PRC believes in that ideology, believes that China needs to be restored to what it was hundreds of years ago, that China's territory should expand, right? Even today, when you look at China's claims in South China Sea, you might have heard of the so-called nine-dash line, the U-shaped line China has drawn in the South China Sea, right? That imaginary line through which China claims the entire islands and the exclusive economic zone. Now, this is not based on any international law. It's not provided under any international treaty or convention. These Chinese claims are based on historical records, based on what the then Chinese empires controlled. So that has no basis in today's international law. By that logic, can India go and claim Afghanistan? Can India go and claim Sri Lanka or parts of Southeast Asia as well? stating Indian civilizations had controlled and extended influence over here. So that has no basis in today's international framework. So China believes in restoring its glory and inherently becomes an insecure power because of this. It constantly fears outside interference and exploitation. There is that mindset which has been created that foreign hand is always present. And the PRC has essentially built its ideology on this premise that only the communists can protect China, can defend Chinese interests, and restore China's lost glory. So, this teaches the Chinese leadership and the society in general to be as aggressive as possible against outside powers, to assert their claims, to even violate existing international rules and make unnecessary claims at the risk of triggering wars and conflicts in order to protect China's frontier territories and periphery so that China will not face any internal threats. So, this approach of China can be explained by its history. Yes, China had a bitter experience during its century of humiliation, right? When it was exploited by colonial powers, by Japan. Definitely, one can empathize with what happened in China because that's exactly what happened with India as well, right? That's the reason why when PRC was formed in 1949, after the end of the Civil War, India was one of the first countries to recognize the PRC. The then Nehru government reached out to China, recognized the nation, though it was established on a radical ideology, an extremist ideology. India empathized with China and we even accepted the one China policy. Because I want you to understand, there were two Chinas that existed at that point, right? The newly formed PRC, established in 1949, the People's Republic of China, led by the Communist Party of China, which mainly controlled mainland China. And until 1949, it was just eastern China that it controlled. Later on, the Communist Party went on to expand its territory by occupying Xinjiang in 1949 and later by annexing Tibet in 1950. That is how China expanded its territory and overnight became a major neighboring country of India in the Himalayan belt. Or else India's Himalayan border was with Tibet, not with China, right? So from the Siachen region till the Nefa or today's Arunachal Pradesh, it was primarily the kingdom of Tibet and partly Xinjiang towards the Central Asia region. So overnight, when China expanded its territory from 1949 to 1950 by forcefully annexing Xinjiang and later Tibet, it became one of India's most important neighboring countries. On the other hand, we have Republic of China, which was then led by the KMT, the Kuomintang Party under Chiang Kai-shek, which has now transitioned into a multi-party democracy, which is based out of Taiwan. The nationalists who were cornered and pushed into Taiwan, right? The ROC, right? The KMT party under Chiang Kai-shek, they relocated to Taiwan. It remained an authoritarian dictatorship for several decades. And in the last 3-4 decades, it has transitioned into a democracy today. But nobody recognizes Taiwan as an independent country, right? Almost all the major powers in the world have accepted that there is only one China. Since this position at the P5 of the UN Security Council was with Republic of China at that point, the question came up as to who will continue to hold the seat. By then, China had been provided the permanent seat by 1945 when the UNSC was formed, right? This seat had gone to Republic of China, which was the then legitimate Chinese government. So after the end of the Civil War and after ROC was toppled and PRC was established, the question came up as to which Chinese government should hold the UN seat. So the PRC initiated the One China policy. It's a Chinese requirement. If a country wants to have diplomatic ties with PRC, they have to acknowledge that there's only one Chinese government, which means they cannot have ties with ROC. They cannot have relations with Taiwan. So India became one of the first countries to accept this. Many criticized Prime Minister Nehru for this, but at that point, for India, it was important to build friendly relations with neighbors. Of course, India was taken aback by the Chinese aggression that came later. So India, which was initially building a good relationship with the neighboring countries because we were already struggling with numerous challenges across our neighborhood, which we have studied last week, right? From the challenges posed by Pakistan to the internal economic challenges to Northeast insurgency, multiple threats were already present. And the last thing we wanted was another hostile neighbor. So, keeping our commitment in mind towards non aggression, and given that we empathized with the Chinese people, their struggle, their century of humiliation, we recognize the Chinese state, despite the ideology being a radical extremist ideology, and accepted the one China policy. Not just India, most countries in the world have accepted the one China policy, right? Even United States, then European powers, they all came around eventually when the US President Nixon opened a new chapter in the US China relations in late 1960s, used Pakistan as a mediator, and his national security advisor, who would later become the Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, would secretly reach out to China in 1969. And eventually, by 1970s, US and China established a formal relationship, with US recognizing the PRC as the legitimate government and accepting the one China policy. So most countries, as I said, they accept the one China policy, which means they acknowledge there is only one Chinese government, which is the PRC, led by the Communist Party that rules over mainland China. So as a result, those countries that accept one China policy, they don't maintain relations with Taiwan. Take India, for example. India doesn't have official diplomatic ties with Taiwan. We just maintain economic and cultural ties, but we don't have a full-fledged embassy, right? We just have a trade and cultural representative office in Delhi and Taipei. Both sides have it. We do have a very strong economic and cultural relationship, but we don't have a formal diplomatic relationship with the ROC. China treats this as a red line. Any country recognizing the ROC, setting up ties with ROC, they will essentially face retaliation from the PRC, right? Then there's also something called one China principle, meaning there's only one Chinese territory. So China's claims over Taiwan and even the other frontier regions, including Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, etc. This is what countries accept. They essentially accept that there's only one unified Chinese territory, including Taiwan is being seen as a part of China. India acknowledges this, most other powers as well. Though US has formally acknowledged it, it maintains an ambiguous position deliberately, and it has armed Taiwan, supplying arms and weapons and backing Taiwan. And essentially, the US is leveraging the Taiwan issue to try and encircle China. So that's a completely different argument altogether. But as you can see, most countries today accept one China policy, meaning there's only one Chinese government, which is the PRC. They don't recognize ROC. They don't have ties with Taiwan. And they recognize there's only one Chinese territory. They recognize that Taiwan is an integral part of China. So again, the Nehru government often faces criticism over this. Yes, it is easy to criticize this decision when you look back in retrospect. But back then, in 1949, this seemed like the right decision for India, right? As I said, the last thing we wanted was a hostile neighbor, and we empathized with China. We hoped for friendly relations. That has been India's intentions all the time, right? We don't seek trouble with anyone. So you might call it a naive principle, but at that point, it seemed like a pragmatic decision, right? To engage with China, to recognize the newly established state, because clearly the PRC was the populist establishment with mass support. But of course, India was wary from the beginning of China's true intentions, which became evident very soon, right? After this friendship that began, India, China initially opened up to each other as we recognized the country, accepted one China policy and one China principle. Naturally, there were friendly relations for a brief period of time. But within few weeks, this myth was broken. When China started displaying its expansionist territorial intentions in 1949, as I stated, it went on to annex Xinjiang, the Turkestan region, which was more interlinked with the Turkestan region of East and the Central Asia region that exists in the Eastern Turkestan belt, right? So the Uyghur Muslim minorities here, they felt oppressed by the Chinese state after being annexed and occupied against their will. That's the reason why, even today, There is resistance from the Uyghur ethnic minority. In fact, they've even taken the extremist path, establishing a radical terror outfit called ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, that wages war against China, seeking to liberate Xinjiang from Chinese occupation. But China is known to brutally crush any rebellion, and it is accused of large scale human rights violations in Xinjiang. The same is the story with Tibet, another frontier territory that was annexed by China in 1950 with a forceful military takeover. In Tibet, which is a Buddhist majority region, the kingdom which had remained as an independent autonomous kingdom for decades, right, which was set up as a buffer by the British, was overnight occupied by China. That's what triggered alarm bells in India. These developments of 1949, 1950. It made it very clear that PRC has expansionist designs, territorial ambitions. And as it became a Himalayan neighbor, obviously India was mindful of the fact that the borders were not clear, that an aggressive expansionist China will become a hostile threat now that the security buffer was gone. Right? The British had cultivated Tibet and the other Himalayan kingdoms as a security buffer against any possible Russian threat from the north. So, post independence, India inherited the buffer strategy that we had followed in the Himalayan belt, which I explained in my previous session as well. Be it Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, Tibet, all these Himalayan kingdoms, they were seen as security buffers by India to the north. With the annexation of Tibet, which was the largest Himalayan kingdom, this triggered immediate alarm for the remaining Himalayan states. Nepal, Bhutan, and Sikkim, they sought India's immediate protection. That explains why Bhutan agreed to be guided by India in its foreign policy through the 1949 treaty. Why India agreed to defend Bhutan against external threats. India built very close defense and strategic ties with Nepal, and Sikkim became a protectorate state of India. So, as the friction began, one by one, the boundary questions started coming up. China was already a little suspicious of India's true intentions, India being a democracy, China being a communist state, an authoritarian state. Of course, there were fundamental differences, political differences. Now, when you look at the developments of 1950 and 51 period, on one side, India had become wary of China's intentions following the annexation of Xinjiang and Tibet, right? As human rights violations were being reported in Tibet, India even raised its voice, urging China to not crush the Tibetan Buddhist community. So, this was misread by China as Indian interference in China's internal matters. That India, after accepting one China principle and one China policy, is now interfering in communist China's internal affairs. That's what China started pursuing under Mao Zedong. Then, as India built close defense and security relations with Nepal, with Sikkim and Bhutan, because remember, Sikkim was not a integral part of the Indian Union at that point. It was just a protectorate state which would merge with India later on in 1975. So, as these Himalayan states, they rushed to India and embraced India into a security defense arrangement. This led China to doubt India's intentions and to be wary of India. By then, the Cold War divisions and rivalries had begun. Though India was very clear that we will not choose sides, we were championing the third world, and later on, we established the NAM, the non aligned movement. China never had trust in India's policies. It always believed that as a democracy, India would naturally align with the Western powers, with United States and European powers. Though that was never the case, China started misreading India's policies and intentions, doubting India's genuineness, and it started assuming that as a democracy, India would naturally align with the West, which was never the case, as we have studied in the last week's classes. Then came the biggest development. After India had reached out to China, when we expressed concern about the Tibetan occupation and the violation of human rights, Mao Zedong personally raised doubts and a suspicion about India's intentions. So that's where the first mistrust and the friction began. And remember, in the last week, I had explained about the five finger policy of Mao Zedong. After annexing Tibet, which was China's prized possession at that point, Mao Zedong advocated the five finger policy, a diplomatic and military strategy. In order to secure Tibet, Mao Zedong advocated that China should interfere, meddle in the five extensions of Tibet, the five fingers of Tibet. If Tibet is like the palm of your hand, according to Mao Zedong, it has five extensions, five fingers. That includes Sikkim, Ladakh, Arunachal Pradesh, which back then was NEFA, Northeast Frontier Agency, then Bhutan and Nepal. That explains why China is super aggressive in all these regions of the Himalayan belt. Be it Chinese interference in Nepal to counter Indian influence, China's pressure on Bhutan, particularly with regard to the boundary disputes, or Chinese incursions and aggression from Ladakh to Arunachal Pradesh, where it refuses to recognize the British era boundaries. It all traces back to Mao Zedong's five finger policy, which was designed to destabilize the neighborhood of Tibet. The strategy was very simple: keep the surrounding areas on the boil permanently, keep meddling, keep interfering, keep pressure on the other countries in the region. So no external power can meddle with Tibet. No external power, be it India or US, can enter Tibet. And for that, you have to keep destabilizing the outer periphery of Tibet. This again shows Chinese aggression, the Chinese mindset, which comes from Mao Zedong's thinking that every outside power is a threat. There is that natural mistrust and suspicion which has been ingrained into Maoist philosophy. And that is why PRC is so aggressive even in today's world. That's why I told you, to understand modern China, current Chinese policies, you need to look back in history. It all goes back to China's century of humiliation, right? The misrule by the nationalists under the Republic of China, by the Kuomintang party, the utopian promise made by Mao Zedong under the Communist Party, right? And the civil war and the victory of the communists in the civil war and the establishment of PRC. That explains why China is so aggressive in today's diplomacy. So, with regard to our boundary disputes, how did it begin? So, by 1950, as you understood, despite initial friendliness, despite India's outreach initially, mutual suspicion, distrust had emerged, some friction had already come up, and it blew up from 1951 to 1954. During this period, China started unauthorized construction of a road in the Aksai Chin region. This is where the first trouble began between India and China. Because, see, over Tibet, it was more of a diplomatic disagreement. It was just mistrust and suspicion, right? We doubted China's intentions when it annexed Tibet. We opposed the human rights violations while the Buddhists were targeted. And China doubted India's intentions, looking at India's policy as an interference in China's internal matters. But the real escalation started with Aksai Chin. From 1951 to 54 period, China began construction of a road in Aksai Chin to link Xinjiang and Tibet. For China, this was a strategic priority. Today, it is the G219 highway, one of the world's longest highways, stretching to almost 10,000 kilometers. The initial stretch of this highway, the construction began in 1951, completed in 1957. You can see why for China this was a critical road. It would basically connect Xinjiang and Tibet, and it passes through Aksai Chin, which is territory that belongs to India. In 1947, when we inherited British era borders between British India and Tibet, we had assumed that the whole of Aksai Chin belongs to India. Though there were some differing perceptions, right? The issues were never addressed. China was a new state that was born after India's independence. India was mindful that the boundary issue might come up into question. And even before we could engage on this matter, China had begun the construction of this road in Indian territory, the G219. For China, it served a security purpose because both the frontier territories which it had occupied, they were facing unrest. The Uyghur Muslims were rebelling against Chinese annexation. Tibetan Buddhists were also leading a liberation movement. So, as unrest spread in Xinjiang and Tibet, it became critical for China to connect the two regions to help the security forces move around and to keep control over these annexed areas. These were the frontier territories for China. So, immediately, India opposed the road construction. The moment India detected the Chinese road construction activity, India opposed the construction, and we published new maps that clearly depicted Aksai Chin as Indian territory based on British era records and British era boundary lines that were created over here. So obviously, China opposed it. For China, it was critical to move ahead with the construction of this highway. Some of you might argue that why is China so obsessed with Aksai Chin? Why should the road pass through Aksai Chin? Why can't it divert the road? Because if you look at the terrain and geography of this region, this is the most viable, shortest route between Xinjiang and Tibet. That explains why China is obsessed with Aksai Chin, especially this section where the G219 highway passes through. So India opposed the construction and published new maps, clearly claiming this territory as Indian territory. And it led to border incursions and clashes between the two armed forces. Several clashes were reported during this period between Indian Army and the Chinese PLA. So before things could go out of hand, India-China made one last attempt to address the suspicion, the mistrust, and to find a friendly diplomatic solution. Prime Minister Nehru met with Zhou Enlai, the then Chinese premier, and popularized the slogan Hindi Chini bye bye. This again is often criticized today that Prime Minister Nehru was naive, that he did not read China accurately. And to a large extent, this assessment is true. At the same time, you can see why this attempt was made. As I said, the last thing India wanted was permanent conflict and hostility with another neighbor. Now, with China, we were sharing a border of 3,600 plus kilometers. Yes, India could have not recognized Tibet. India could have, raised questions about the Tibet annexation. But the thinking back then was this would only contribute to more trouble in the region. It would unnecessarily aggravate the issues, which could be detrimental to India's security, right? So, also the vision of India to be a responsible power, to play a positive role, right? The Cold War divisions was already breaking up the world order, and India was the last country which wanted to contribute to this, right? So, yes, you can look at it as a naive policy. The mistakes of Prime Minister Nehru, according to me, would come much later. From 1959 to 61 period, plenty of strategic mistakes were made. But if you ask me about the initial outreach, the friendly relationship, the recognition of China, and recognition of one China policy, Tibet and Taiwan, should we have done it? Should we have reached out with a hand of friendship? At that point, it was the right policy to initiate. But later on, as China became aggressive post 1954-55, there were few mistakes that were made, which we will discuss in a short while. Right? Nehru is largely blamed for the blunders of 1962, and rightly so. There were few tactical blunders, strategic mistakes that were made, mainly in the 1959, 60, 61 period. But these policies before that, right, they can't be seen as a naive mistake on India's part. It was genuinely a well-intentioned foreign policy, which ended up being misused by China. So, following the visit and the meeting of the two leaders, the Panchsheel doctrine was rolled out, inspired by Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist principles. The principle of the middle path. The Panchsheel in Buddhism is a guide for a Buddhist monk to lead a life where they don't interfere with others' lives, where they respect the individual autonomy of the others and adopt a middle path approach to prevent conflicts and escalations. This doctrine was adopted into diplomacy between India and China. In fact, the Panchsheel principles became so popular after this. It was used to lay the foundation for the non-aligned movement, which we studied last week. It was adopted by the UN General Assembly as well through a UN resolution, right? It became the guiding principle for many of China's bilateral agreements with other Asian countries. China went on to sign several agreements with other Asian countries like Philippines and the others, and even their relationship was built on the Panchsheel principle. So this again highlights the cultural link that we share. So under the Panchsheel, the five principles of peaceful coexistence, both countries promised to mutually respect each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, which essentially meant India will not question China over Taiwan, Tibet, or Xinjiang or Hong Kong. And in return, China will respect India's territorial claims, be it with regard to Aksai Chin, with regard to Kashmir, and any other issue which could come up. Both sides will respect each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, and they commit to non-aggression. Since few military escalations had already occurred in Aksai Chin over the road construction, both sides made a commitment to mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference in each other's internal affairs. China will not meddle internally in India. India will not meddle inside China. So this applies for Tibet, it applies for Kashmir, mainly the conflict zones. Equality and mutual benefit. Both sides will treat each other as equal partners. They will strive towards a mutually beneficial partnership. And finally, they'll peacefully coexist with each other. Any issues that comes up, they will resolve it through talks, through negotiations, not through war, not through conflict. In fact, few years ago when Manmohan Singh was the prime minister, he made a very profound statement. When India, China were the two rising Asian giants in early 2000s, it was widely anticipated that India, China will be natural enemies, right? It's also based on the Kautilyan thought that two neighbors can never be friends when they share resources, when they have differences and disputes. It's natural for enmity to develop and the neighboring state to become a Ari state, which is what Chanakya refers to in the Arthashastra, right? But Prime Minister Manmohan Singh stated that the world is large enough to accommodate the rise of both India and China. If both countries can work together, address the mistrust, address the suspicion, build a mutually beneficial partnership respecting these principles, the world is indeed large enough to accommodate the rise of both India and China. We need not be natural enemies. We need not be at conflict because history offers us a lesson. Thousands of years ago, if Indian empires worked with the Chinese dynasties, right? If civilizational links had been maintained, both at that point were great civilizations, two of the greatest civilizations ever. And if that did not lead to conflict, today, obviously, there is a possibility where India, China can actually work together and be friends. But some of the unfortunate developments that happened, right? China's aggression, China's territorial ambition, and its desire to dominate the region, its desire to put down the other neighbors and teach India a lesson, and some mistakes on India's part, primarily by Prime Minister Nehru and his defense minister V.K. Menon, they ended up being disastrous policies on the Indian side, right? The military mobilization on India's part, the military preparedness, and the lack of farsightedness with regard to how to deal with an aggressive neighbor like China, right? As I said, the policies before 1955, you can still think of it as a well intentioned policy, but what happened next by both sides is something which triggered the 1962 conflict. China shares majority of the blame. China was the aggressor. India also shares a part of the blame because of the policy short-sightedness on the part of the Nehru government. So if you see, all these five principles were broken by both the sides very soon. China would break almost all the five principles. India would also break some of these commitments. The promise of not interfering in others' internal affairs, the promise of not respecting each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, these principles were broken almost immediately. So, in many ways, the Panchashil was a big failure. It failed to address the rising tensions between the two countries. Now, when you look at the India China border, first I want you to understand the three different sectors which are part of this disputed border. This border is divided into the western sector, which is primarily in the Ladakh region. Then you have the middle sector in the Himachal Pradesh Uttarakhand region. And finally, we have the eastern sector covering the Sikkim, Arunachal Pradesh region. These are the three sectors into which the India-China border is divided. So one major dispute is over Aksai Chin over here. The second is with regard to this boundary line, the McMahon Line, which India considers to be the boundary between Tibet and Arunachal Pradesh. Now let's dive a little deeper into this. Let's specifically talk about Aksai Chin, what is the nature of the dispute, and I'll take you to Arunachal Pradesh as well, and we'll understand what are India's claims, what are China's claims, and what is the current situation on the ground. When you look at Aksai Chin, the map clearly tells you it occupies a strategic location, right? In the Karakoram ranges, offering a connect with Xinjiang and Tibet, with Kashmir on the other side, a vital route which can enable trade and connectivity. So, from China's perspective, Aksai Chin is mainly critical for the G219 highway to connect Xinjiang and Tibet. For India, it's about the historical claims and what we inherited from the British. So, when it comes to the boundaries here between the then Kingdom of Tibet and British India, there were two major lines that were drawn by the British. One is the Johnson's Line, drawn in 1865 between British India and Tibet. So, when the Johnson Line was drawn out, there were representatives from China as well. There were representatives from India as well. Of course, modern India, modern China didn't exist, but there were representatives that essentially agreed that Johnson Line would be the demarcation. So the Johnson Line is nothing but the current claim of India. Can you see this dark blue line? Essentially, if you look at the official map of India that shows the whole of Jammu and Kashmir as Indian territory, which is today's Ladakh region, right? This is your Johnson Line, this dark blue line, drawn in 1865, and that is what India considers to be the right border. Is that clear? This is what India considers as the correct border. Later on, in 1893, a second line was carved out, the Macartney-Macdonald line, that lies towards the west of the Johnson line. Can you see the dotted line over here? I'll draw it in red. This is the Macartney-Macdonald line, which is slightly westwards of the Johnson line. This is what China used to consider as the right border. You can see the highway, the G219, that passes over here, linking Xinjiang with Tibet. So by 1951, China started constructing this highway. Back then, it was known as the Western Highway of China. Now it's the G219. So for China, it was all about securing access to Xinjiang and Tibet, to secure the internal unrest, to oppress and crush the internal rebellions of the Uyghurs and the Tibetan Buddhists. So China conveniently refers to Macartney-Macdonald line as the accepted boundary line. But following the 1962 war, China made deep inroads. It occupied this entire stretch. And today, the line of actual control lies somewhere over here. This is China's current perception of the border between India and China in the Ladakh sector. India's perception of LAC lies over here. India's perception lies somewhere over here. Even with regard to the de facto border, that is the LAC, the line of actual control, it's a temporary border. Even with regard to this, our perceptions are different. The Chinese perception is much westwards, much more towards the west, whereas Indian perception is largely towards the east. So there is a perception difference. So this is what leads to regular incursions, where the patrolling units often cross over into the other side. India's perceptions are different, Chinese perceptions are different. And sometimes PLA troops cross over onto the Indian side. Sometimes it could be deliberate by the Chinese. So that leads to regular clashes, tensions, and escalations in the Ladakh sector. So this was the first dispute that China opened with India. First, the construction of this road, which in itself was illegal. Then claiming the Macartney-Macdonald line as the boundary, and later occupying this entire territory and pushing the de facto border largely westwards to take away the whole Aksai Chin to itself. That represents a significant territorial loss for India. India lost this entire stretch of Aksai Chin in the 1962 war. Until then, it was just Chinese road construction and some presence over here. But during the war, China made deep inroads into Aksai Chin, taking the entire region, pushing back the Indian presence. And today, the LAC has shifted to this stretch. Even there, we have a different perception with regard to where exactly the line of actual control passes through. So that is the ground reality. Now look at the eastern sector. See, initially, China had never questioned India's sovereignty over Arunachal Pradesh. Back then, it was known as NEFA, Northeast Frontier Agency. All of a sudden, China opens a new claim. After the tensions with Aksai Chin had already escalated by late 1950s, China deliberately opens a new front towards the eastern sector by questioning the validity of the McMahon Line. Now, what is this McMahon Line and why did China do this? In Aksai Chin, at least, China had some strategic objective to build a key highway to link Xinjiang and Tibet. But what was the intention in Arunachal Pradesh? Why did it question the McMahon Line? The McMahon Line was drawn in 1914 through the Shimla Convention between British India and the then Kingdom of Tibet. Even here, there were representatives of India and China present. Of course, it was not modern China, not the nation state of India, right? Neither countries were existing at that point. So China's argument is that why should PRC accept the McMahon Line when PRC didn't even exist in 1914? When India also did not exist in 1914. China wants a fresh negotiation over this. But India believed that this was a deliberate move. Since Aksai Chin issue had come up, to distract India further, to destabilize India and to put India on the back foot, a new claim was deliberately opened by claiming Arunachal Pradesh as South Tibet. Even today, China does not recognize Arunachal as Indian territory, right? It continues to treat this as South Tibet. It even tries to give Mandarin names to some of the villages in Arunachal Pradesh. So this was a deliberate strategy to push India on the back foot. In fact, it is even reported that in late 50s, China sent a proposal to Prime Minister Nehru that we are ready to settle the boundary issue. And China's proposal was, you give up your claim over Aksai Chin. Let China keep Aksai Chin. In return, China will not claim Arunachal Pradesh. India can claim Arunachal Pradesh. Reportedly, this proposal was made, an exchange, a compromise. Arunachal for Aksai Chin. But India rightly rejected this claim. India rejected this entire proposal, this idea. Because see, both were territories of India. You can't occupy a part of a territory, make another claim and then propose a trade-off. It would be a fair trade-off, a fair compromise if India was occupying Chinese territory, right? If China was also occupying a part of a territory, and then we arrive at a compromise, then we trade off. That is a fair compromise. Here, Aksai Chin and Arunachal, both are Indian territories. China is the one which occupied Aksai Chin. China is the one making these unsubstantiated, baseless claims over Arunachal Pradesh, and then it proposes a trade-off, a compromise. So naturally, India rejected this proposal, right? So you can see Mao's five-finger policy in action. The interference in Arunachal Pradesh, the rejection of McMahon Line, calling it South Tibet is all an extension of five-finger policy of Mao Zedong. To secure Tibet, China has to destabilize the outer periphery of Tibet. That explains China's actions in Nepal, in Sikkim, in Bhutan, right? In Ladakh, and as well as in Arunachal Pradesh. As long as these Himalayan regions keep boiling, Tibet remains firmly under Chinese control. And you can trace it back to Mao's extremist radical ideology. It can be traced back to the expansionist ideology of Maoism and the insecurity that China faces. So no wonder China is often seen by experts as a bully, a classic bully. If you're a student of psychology, you would know that bullies are generally very, very insecure, right? So China as a nation state has been insecure because of its century of humiliation, right? It was a devastating period where China's greatness was destroyed. Yes, largely by outside powers, by colonial powers, by Japan. And this has continued to basically inspire China's current approach. So China's entire model of being super aggressive is built on its history of humiliation. And it believes that the only way it can protect itself is by acting like a bully, by threatening others, by destabilizing the neighborhood, by claiming others' territories. and that has become integral to Chinese foreign policy. So, whenever China has had very ambitious authoritarian leaders like Xi Jinping, for example, Xi Jinping is trying to create a legacy for himself, right? He wants to project himself as the next Mao, right? In China, there has been no other celebrated leader like Mao Zedong. Deng Xiaoping comes closer, but largely for economic reforms. But Xi Jinping is positioning himself as a combination of Deng Xiaoping and Mao Zedong, someone who championed China's economic rise along with China's military assertiveness. That explains why China today is very, very aggressive, just like Mao's China, right? Now, when you see the events that actually led to the war, there were few other developments that took place. Now we understood that by 1958-59, the stage had been set. Differences had cropped up, few border clashes had taken place. China had claimed Aksai Chin, it had occupied some territory and built a road. It was now claiming Arunachal Pradesh as well, right? India had expressed concern about Tibet. In fact, this is where I want you to know about a very interesting development that involved US and India. A covert partnership had taken shape between 1959 and 1960s period. Since both feared the aggression of China and China's race towards a nuclear bomb, and since US did not recognize the PRC at that point, US China and India, though we were non-aligned, though India was committed to non-alignment, we actually launched a joint covert operation to monitor China's nuclear program and also to keep an eye on the developments in Tibet. India's intelligence bureau, which was the only intelligence agency that we had at that point, right? Because RAW was created much later in 1968. So until 1968, from 1947 to 1968, IB was the sole intelligence agency handling both domestic and foreign intelligence. The IB collaborated with the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA helped IB raise a special unit called Establishment 22, a highly secretive elite unit. It was mainly made up of Tibetan refugees. After the Tibetan refugees came into India following the Tibetan uprising, and India accommodated them as refugees and gave them asylum, these Tibetan refugees were recruited into a special force unit, a highly secretive covert unit called Establishment 22, that was used for covert operations in Tibet to monitor the developments, to back the Tibetan liberation movement, and to keep an eye on China's nuclear testing, which had begun in the Gobi Desert. So this was a very interesting period in geopolitics, where India, though it was neutral, it was championing the third world, championing the non-aligned ideology. But because of the threat posed by China and the common concerns that US shared with India, both intelligence agencies worked together. That's where it is said that a joint IB and CIA team that was supposed to deploy a monitoring, a sensory system on the Himalayan mountains, they lost the device, which was powered by radioactive material. And that's the reason why certain sections of the Himalayas is completely sealed off till date, right? Especially the Valley of Flowers and the Nanda Devi peak, right? This whole stretch is shut off permanently. For many decades, it remained a classified state secret. But now, declassified material has shown that a radioactive material, a nuclear a radioactive powered device was lost, never to be found, which raises the risk of a nuclear contamination, a radioactive contamination, right? Both CIA, IB were supposed to install a device, a monitoring device, to monitor China's nuclear testing. But during this expedition, unfortunately, the device was lost, never to be found again. And that's why some parts of the Valley of Flowers and the Nanda Devi stretch is permanently shut off for civilians. So while these developments were happening, the uprising in Tibet, where Tibetans rose up in mass rebellion under the leadership of a young Dalai Lama, this was brutally crushed by the Chinese state. As you know, in communist China, there is no scope for dissent, right? No scope for rebellion. And given how China considers Tibet to be critical for its national security, it brutally crushed the uprising, committing large scale atrocities. And thousands of Tibetan refugees, including the Dalai Lama himself, fled to India, sought asylum in India, and India, on humanitarian grounds, offered refuge to the Tibetan refugees. They were settled primarily in Dharamshala in Himachal Pradesh, where India took a controversial decision. India not only gave a seat to the Dalai Lama, India allowed a parallel Tibetan government to function, the Central Tibetan Administration, which functions even today from Dharamshala. So China saw this as a direct threat posed by India. China saw this as India's breach of the Panchsheel commitment, that India was meddling in China's sovereignty and internal affairs. It was sheltering the anti nationals, according to China. So, India offered a seat to the Dalai Lama at Dharamshala, allowed a parallel Tibetan administration to function, to lead Tibetan liberation movement from India. Then, the other major Tibetan refugee camp is in Karnataka. I think you should be aware of this. A little away from Mysore, as you approach Madikeri, right? There is a massive Tibetan settlement. Can you find out the exact place where this huge Tibetan settlement is located in Karnataka? Please mention that in the comment section below. So, as India accepted the Tibetan refugees, gave a seat to Dalai Lama, allowed the Tibetans to run a parallel administration, China saw this as a hostile move by the Nehru government. Now, China decided that India should be taught a lesson. By then, China was aware of India US intelligence collaboration that was taking place. It always had its suspicion about India aligning with Western powers, right? So now China decided that India should be taught a lesson, India should be hit back. And that's what primarily triggered the next level of developments, which led to the 1962 war. So as China escalated, it started mobilizing its troops. By 1960, China's military infrastructure in the border areas was being stepped up, right? And China always had a natural geographical advantage because Tibet is largely a plateau, very easy to build roads and railway lines. Though it's a high altitude region, the flat terrain makes it much easy for China to construct border infrastructure and enable the deployment of its military forces and equipment right up to the border. But that is not the case for India. India has a natural geographical disadvantage, right? If Indian troops have to be moved to forward positions, you have to push them up in altitude, up the Himalayan mountains, where you encounter very harsh terrain and a very, very harsh climate. So, Indian forces were barely prepared for this. Imagine the Indian army of that era, which had just fought a war with Pakistan. We barely had sufficient presence towards the Himalayan border. We were clearly outnumbered. According to many records, books, and documented evidence, when the 62 war broke out eventually, Indian troops were outnumbered in a 1 is to 3 ratio. Meaning, for every one Indian soldier we mobilized, there were 3 Chinese soldiers mobilized from the other side. And this is where the short sightedness of Nehru is called out for criticism. He was largely led by the advice of his defense minister, the controversial V.K. Menon, who shares much of the blame. Despite the advice of the Indian military and strategic and intelligence establishment, Nehru adopted an aggressive military approach known as the forward policy. Nehru believed that India had the capability to take on China. He was misled largely by V.K. Menon, and it was essentially the short sightedness of the leadership of the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister. They went against military advice. They went against the advice of the IB. They went against the advice of the entire strategic establishment and initiated an aggressive policy, a tit for tat policy. To counter China's mobilization, India launched a counter mobilization plan trying to deploy troops in forward positions. And this escalated the tensions even further. China read this as a signal that India is preparing for war. See, such counter mobilization strategies will work if you truly have deterrence, right? Meaning you should have proven capability to inflict damage on the other. That's where you create an equivalence and prevent the conflict from taking place. But when you don't have the capabilities and the resources, when you are already in a disadvantageous position, diplomacy is the only way out. Diplomacy is what prevents war. So instead of trying out the diplomatic path, suddenly Nehru regime shifted towards a more aggressive military approach, the forward policy, where India was clearly outnumbered. Right? Indian Army didn't have specialized high altitude mountaineering units. They lacked the gear and the weather related equipment. They didn't have the right arms and weapons. They didn't have the right protective gear and clothing. Right? So eventually, when China saw India's mobilization, India was building watchtowers, India was trying to bring in military logistics into forward areas. China saw this as India's preparation for war. So in 1962, China decided enough is enough, and it launched a unilateral act of aggression against India. So, as I said, much of the blame lies with China. China was the primary aggressor from day one. From 1949 to 1962, much of the blame lies with China. But mistakes on the Indian side, right? Especially post 1958-59, the policy mistakes, the policy short sightedness is what contributed to the devastating defeat in 1962 war. The decision to not use the Indian Air Force. Obviously, the Air Force had very limited capabilities to fight a high altitude war. And all these weaknesses on the Indian part led to a massive defeat for India. China made a huge incursion. One was through Aksai Chin sector in Ladakh. The other was through Arunachal Pradesh in the eastern sector. According to reports, the Chinese troops made rapid advances within a month. The war lasted hardly a month, right? Began on October 20th, ended by 21st, if I'm not wrong. So, in this short 1 month war, China made rapid advances, took Aksai Chin, as we saw in the map. It pushed beyond the McMahon line and took the entire Aksai Chin region, and it came under China's illegal occupation. And what happened towards northeast India is even more scary. Chinese troops not only ran over border villages in Arunachal Pradesh, they even took over places like Tawang. In some sectors, they reached the opening of the Assam plains, which is a very vulnerable point. Potentially, they could have reached Siliguri, cut off the northeast and the Brahmaputra Valley from rest of India. That's why Indian military planners became extremely worried about our weakness at Siliguri after the 62 war. Because in the future conflict, they feared that China could use its advantageous position, make quick inroads towards Siliguri and cut off northeast India from rest of the country. So essentially, India's mindset became very negative, defensive. It was a psychological blow for India. In fact, after achieving its objectives, it is China which unilaterally declared a ceasefire. Right? China called off the war on its own because its main purpose had been achieved. Its main intention was to take Aksai Chin. So once they had taken Aksai Chin, within another few weeks, China retreated. They gave up all the territories they had occupied in Arunachal Pradesh. Some of the border villages, including Tawang, where they had reached the doorsteps of Assam plains. From here, China retreated and gave back all the territory in the eastern sector. So in the eastern sector, China did not occupy any of the territory. It returned and pulled back the troops on its own. But in the western sector, China occupied Aksai Chin permanently. And that shows this was China's real intention. The war was designed to not just deliver a humiliating defeat to India, to deliver a psychological blow to India, but also to capture Aksai Chin and retain its strategic hold over Aksai Chin region. So this war had serious consequences for India. It was not just a embarrassment and a humiliation that we had been clearly outmatched, outnumbered. It essentially led to a direct nexus developing between the two arch hostile neighbors of India, China and Pakistan. The strategic nexus started developing. As they say, enemy is a friend. Right? Kautilya talks about this in the Arthashastra. He advised the king to treat Ari's Ari as a Mitra. And it was natural for China, Pakistan to start working together. Pakistan had already fought a war with India. The Kashmir issue was still a active and present issue at that point. Immediately after the 62 war, a China-Pakistan strategic nexus started emerging. In 1963, the Sino-Pak boundary agreement was signed where Pakistan gave away a part of occupied Kashmir, the Shaksgam Valley. the strategic Shaksgam Valley that you can see here in the Gilgit-Baltistan region. This is Gilgit-Baltistan. This would be Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. You can see the line of control here and the line of actual control with China. So Shaksgam Valley was leased by Pakistan to China, and till date, China maintains control over Shaksgam. PLA troops are deployed over here, essentially making China a party to the Kashmir dispute. In fact, China has even built infrastructure through Shaksgam Valley. Few road and rail projects have been built. And the CPEC corridor, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, part of the Belt and Road Initiative, passes through Gilgit-Baltistan region, which brings China as a party into the Kashmir issue. And you know India's position. India rejects any third-party involvement. We treat the Kashmir issue as just a bilateral issue to be resolved with Pakistan alone. But China's investments in Gilgit-Baltistan and China's control over Shaksgam Valley since 1963, because of this boundary agreement, complicates the Kashmir issue as well. And now we face a two-front threat. The possibility of a simultaneous war with Pakistan and China. China started arming Pakistan from here onwards, right? Supplying advanced weapons, military hardware, directly supporting Pakistan's nuclear and missile program. See, Pakistan's nuclear and missile program is essentially a cut, copy, paste of the Chinese program, right? China proliferated nuclear material, nuclear technology, ensured Pakistan became a nuclear state with advanced delivery systems and missile capabilities. And if you look at Pakistani weapon systems today, from their radars to air defense systems, right, to most of their missiles, their fighter jets, even their warships and submarines, they are all of Chinese design, Chinese origin. During Operation Sindoor, China has taken it to one step ahead. It's not just weapons collaboration and military technology. China is providing active satellite intelligence, helping Pakistan to pick out targets in India. So this nexus became much stronger, turning into a military, diplomatic, and a strategic nexus, which has become a two-front challenge for India. Plus, the psychological blow is something that we never recovered from. Believe it or not, for many decades, until early 2000s, until the Vajpayee-Manmohan Singh era, for nearly 40 years, Indian strategy became so defensive that governments took a deliberate decision not to develop advanced border infrastructure. Why? Because if you build border roads and rail networks, the fear was within our strategic establishment that tomorrow, if there is a war, if China attacks India, they might use our own infrastructure to make deeper penetration into Indian territory. That was the defensive mindset which got created. So from 1962 to early 2000s, India did not adopt an aggressive approach towards border infrastructure and military modernization. The idea was, don't develop the border areas. Let it be as it is, so that if at all there is an attack, it will be difficult for China to make inroads deeper into Indian territory. This policy was reversed only in the last 20-25 years, starting with Vajpayee government and then Manmohan Singh government and now the Modi government, where India has adopted an aggressive policy towards border infrastructure and military mobilization, right? So these consequences, they left behind a lasting legacy. They completely damaged the India-China relationship for decades together, right? In fact, throughout 1970s, there was hardly any contact. The first major improvement in the relationship came in 1979 when Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who was the then External Affairs Minister under the Morarji Desai government, visited China. That was the first opening after the 62 war. But the real reset was in 1988 under Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. This helped reset the relationship after 2 decades of hostility. Few incursions kept on happening, clashes kept on happening, especially at places like Nathula in Sikkim, right? And did you know, China did not recognize Sikkim's merger with India for almost 30 years. Until early 2000s, China did not recognize Sikkim's integration with India, though it merged in 1975. For 3 decades, China did not see Sikkim as a part of India. It was only in early 2000s it recognized Sikkim as a part of India. So following Rajiv Gandhi's visit, the relations were normalized because now the priorities for China and India, they were changing. Both were looking at their economic development. China had already opened up under the reforms initiated by Deng Xiaoping from late 70s to 1980s. China was already emerging as a manufacturing hub. It was looking to increase its exports. It was looking to become the manufacturing powerhouse of the world. So it needed partnership with large countries like India. And India as well was finally on the edge of transitioning, right, towards a more open economy. So the economic requirements and the changing geopolitics pushed India China closer in the 1990s. By 1991, as we studied last week, the Cold War ended. USSR had collapsed. The US had emerged as a superpower. The unipolar world had begun, right? So India China started collaborating from 1990s. And in fact, until 2009, the relations actually started improving. Though the differences remained, both countries realized they needed each other. They need to look beyond the border issues. So they isolated the border issues, they created different mechanisms to deal with them, and parallelly, they stepped up their economic and diplomatic cooperation. So today, the reason why India China have never fought another major conflict is because there are few arrangements which have been put in place to prevent a small boundary level escalation from turning into a bigger conflict. See, the last few years, we have so many incursions that have taken place. The Doklam crisis, the recent Ladakh standoff, or repeated Chinese incursions from Tawang region to the Ladakh sector. Despite all these incursions and military standoffs, none of them have actually turned into a bigger conflict. That's because there are few boundary mechanisms that have been created in the 1990s. It all started with the historic visit of PV Narasimha Rao in the early 1990s. In 1993, Prime Minister PV Narasimha Rao built upon the visit of Rajiv Gandhi, and during this historic visit, the Peace and Tranquility Agreement was signed along the line of actual control. Through this, both India and China have made some commitments. They have created a mechanism to prevent unnecessary escalations, to manage any escalation which might occur, and ensure that escalations don't turn into a bigger conflict. They have created a negotiating hierarchy where local military commanders can engage with each other to find local solutions without involving the rest of the higher leadership. There are several protocols that have been implemented to prevent any miscommunication or development of mistrust. And this has played a very big role in preventing small dispute from turning into a bigger conflict. Then in 1996, the second important boundary agreement, the confidence building measures or CBMs, they were initiated through this agreement in 1996. So as part of these two agreements, there is a boundary level talks initiated between senior military commanders. It begins at the local level. If let's say there is a incursion from one side to the other side, it could happen by Indian Army or it could happen by the PLA. Because of the differing perception of line of actual control, both sides they have a different idea where exactly the current border is present, the temporary border. So we can't allow these minor incursions to turn into a bigger conflict, right? So that's why if such incursions happen, or if let's say a confrontation takes place between the patrolling units or the forward forces, instead of escalating it, the local commanders will meet. They will have a direct hotline to the other side. They'll talk, they'll try to find local solutions to prevent this from escalating. If they can't find a solution, they will escalate it to the next level. The senior military commanders at the brigade level, they will try to engage directly and they will try to find a solution without dragging the entire government into it. Because once you drag the entire leadership, it becomes political, it becomes more sensitive, and the media could sensationalize it. And the pressure that builds up on the government could even push the countries towards war. And that is something you can't afford with both sides being nuclear armed today. Right? India's nuclear program has been primarily aimed at China to create deterrence against China. Obviously, when we tested the nuclear weapons in 74 and 98, China was obviously angry and it even retaliated. But both sides have managed to move beyond that. The nuclear element has brought the deterrence into picture, right? Creating a space for peace and stability. Both sides cannot afford a bigger war with potential nuclear consequences. So these two boundary agreements are very, very critical from preventing those escalations from happening. So it creates a boundary level negotiation mechanism, a hierarchical mechanism where military commanders will try to find solutions without dragging the higher leadership into it. Then there are other restrictions. Both sides, they can't carry heavy weaponry and deploy heavy weaponry within 10 kilometers of the border, right? They can't open fire. No opening fire against each other. That's why whenever you read about a military standoff or a clash between Indian Army and PLA, you would have read that they beat up each other, they threw stones, or they used cricket bats, hockey sticks to beat up each other, or wooden clubs, barbed wire, etc. As if it's two street gangs which are fighting. It doesn't appear like two professional armies, right? The reason is both sides are prohibited from carrying heavy weaponry and opening fire against each other. Because without this standard protocol, imagine if one incursion turns into a bigger clash or fight and the troops open fire, killing troops on the other side. That is the recipe for a bigger conflict. So, to prevent that, there are restrictions on both sides, a standard protocol where both sides are prohibited from carrying heavy weaponry. They're strictly prohibited from opening fire. That's why they beat up each other. They get into a fist fight, a hand to hand combat, or they pelt stones, or they use bats and sticks to beat up each other. That's why these kind of clashes are reported. Plus, there are restrictions on the stationing and deployment of heavy weaponry in the forward areas, like battle tanks, artillery guns, fighter jets. Even if they conduct a military exercise, they have to face the other side. They have to face inwards. For example, if let's say China plans a military exercise in Tibet, the exercise can't be conducted facing India. It has to face China. Same restriction for India. If we plan a military exercise in Ladakh or Arunachal Pradesh, the formation they should face inwards towards India, not towards the border, because that could send a wrong signal. It could be misread, misconstrued, and one mistake, one miscommunication is enough to result in a bigger conflict. So all these restrictions are created through the 1993 Peace and Tranquility Agreement and the 1996 Confidence Building Measures Agreement. Then in 2003, following the historic visit of Prime Minister Vajpayee, a new era of India China friendship was opened. Finally, China recognized Sikkim as a part of India. That's what led to the reopening of the Nathula Pass, which had been shut in 1967. Following the 1967 border incursions and clashes, Nathula Pass had been permanently sealed. And after China recognized Sikkim, finally it was reopened in the 2006-2007 period, right? Along with that, both sides have established a new mechanism, the SR mechanism, Special Representative Mechanism, to find a political solution for the boundary dispute. Both sides appoint their special representatives. From India, it is the National Security Advisor. China appoints its state counselor, who acts as the foreign minister, the equivalent of China's, uh, essentially equivalent of India's NSA, right? How India's NSA advises the prime minister on foreign security policy. China's state counselor, who's a senior high ranking member of the Communist Party, right, who's part of the Politburo, will advise the general secretary, the Chinese president. And he's handling the foreign policy of China along with the national security affairs. So the state counselor is seen as the equivalent of India's NSA. So these two representatives are considered as the special envoys, the special representatives of the two leaders. And they are mandated to find a political solution, to identify the political parameters, to find a political settlement, to end the boundary dispute altogether. This was the biggest breakthrough. In fact, until 2009, multiple rounds of SR talks had taken place. This was continued by the Manmohan Singh government. Until 2009, SR talks were happening regularly between the two special representatives. They even came out with a set of political parameters to guide the negotiations. And who knows, if everything had gone according to plan, probably both sides could have found a solution to resolve the boundary question through a political settlement, which means through negotiations, not through war and conflict. But the developments that occurred during this period broke the special representative mechanism. China all of a sudden started carrying out new incursions from 2009 onwards. And especially after 2010, China became even more aggressive and it broke the friendly ties, mainly because India was getting closer to United States. After the India-US nuclear deal, India started buying arms, weapons from the US. We elevated the Malabar naval exercise, which until then was just a bilateral naval exercise. We invited Australia, Japan, and Singapore as well in 2007. So China saw this as an aggressive move by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. China retaliated against it, right? China started putting pressure on India. Then President Obama adopted the pivot to Asia policy, where US started focusing on the Eastern Hemisphere, focusing on containing China under its pivot to Asia policy. So China believed that now US was working with India, Japan, and Australia to contain China's growth, to restrict China militarily in the Indo-Pacific. So from here onwards, China started getting super aggressive against India with regular incursions, escalations, and that's why the SR talks were broken and it came to a halt. This mechanism was finally reactivated in 2020 after the Galwan River Valley clashes, after the Galwan incident. And now, since the Ladakh standoff has been resolved and the standoff has come to an end, from 2025 onwards, SR talks have been resumed. This year, the two special representatives are all set to meet again. One meeting took place last year in 2025. So, after a break of several years, the SR mechanism has now been reactivated after the Ladakh crisis and the standoff was resolved in 2024. So, last year, the SR mechanism has been completely reactivated, and this year, SR talks are again expected to take place. Then in 2013, the fourth boundary agreement was signed, the BDCA, Border Defense Cooperation Agreement, under which fresh restrictions were introduced, fresh prohibitions to prevent misunderstanding. For example, a patrol team should not tail the other patrolling team. That creates a sense of anxiety. It could lead to unnecessary mistakes being made at the front line. So, for example, a Chinese patrol party should not tail and follow the Indian patrol units. That's an aggressive maneuver. So those aggressive maneuvers are prohibited to avoid any miscalculation and to improve the communication between the two sides. So a lot of new restrictions have been brought in through the Border Defense Cooperation Agreement. Now, one last point before we end the class today. Despite all these agreements, despite all these protocols and restrictions, how come the Ladakh crisis went out of hand? Why did it escalate? Why did China carry out such a massive escalation? Right? What happened at Galwan? What happened at these flashpoints? Because in 2020, when the world was busy dealing with the pandemic, China carried out deliberate incursions. These were not accidents. See, sometimes troops accidentally cross over. It can happen from the Indian side as well because of the differing perception of the line of actual control. But this was no accident. When incursions occur simultaneously at multiple locations, that is clearly by design. And it can't happen without approval of the highest leadership, probably from the General Secretary himself, the Chinese president himself. So in 2020, April-May period, we saw multiple Chinese incursions at the Panongso Lake, both at the north and south bank, massive incursion at the Galwan River Valley, at Depsang Plains and Demchok. So India responded. Since India's military preparedness has improved, India's border infrastructure, military mobilization, and logistics have improved. India did not take it lying down. India retaliated with a counter mobilization. And by June 2020, we were staring at a massive military standoff between the two sides. And this led to a clash at Galwan River Valley, where a fist fight broke out between Indian Army and the PLA, and many soldiers, they lost balance and they were pushed down the river valley. 20 Indian Army soldiers were martyred. Several PLA soldiers were reportedly killed as well, though China never acknowledged it. This was the biggest escalation since 1962, bigger than Doklam. And there were every signs that were visible that a bigger war might break out. Right? Indian Air Force was carrying out very proactive forward mobilization. Indian Army was in a heightened mode of war preparation. Even the Indian Navy had been put on heightened alert. So, what led to this massive escalation? According to reports, China has changed the status quo. Reportedly, it has occupied some part of territory again. India denies it. The Modi government has denied it. But there are reports pointing out that China might have occupied several square kilometers of territory which was previously patrolled by Indian Army. So, following this escalation, India carried out an operation at Rezangla and Spangnur Gap using the SFF, the Special Frontier Force, which is nothing but your Establishment 22, which I was mentioning earlier. Establishment 22 later became the SFF, which is the special branch or the special operations branch of RAW. So, along with elite Indian Army units and artillery and tank formations, India carried out an offensive operation in the Spangnur Gap, occupying a critical position, maintaining a vantage point, and pushing back the Chinese presence at this sector, while China dominated the other flashpoints from Depsang Plain to Panongso Lake. So, after several months of heightened tensions, finally, we activated the border mechanisms. India requested China to reactivate the SR talks, and this paved the way for the border talks to begin between military commanders. By 2023, the standoff was resolved at least three locations: at Galwan River Valley, at Hot Springs area, and also at the Panongso Lake, both at the north and south bank. At these locations, through the military commander talks, they found a resolution to de escalate, to pull back the troops. They created even something called as a buffer zone, which will not be patrolled by both the sides. This is where opposition parties are criticizing the government that even areas which were previously patrolled by Indian Army have reportedly been compromised. The Modi government has apparently agreed to stop patrolling some of the buffer zones, which is now being constituted as a loss of Indian territory, right? But the government has denied the allegations, so we don't have a clear picture regarding this. We have very limited information with regard to what exactly has been agreed. But at these three locations, the both the sides, they definitely pulled back the troops. Normal patrolling was resumed. They de-escalated and disengaged. But the standoff continued at two locations: at Depsang Plain and Demchok. At Depsang Plain and Demchok, the standoff continued until 2024. So essentially, the Ladakh standoff lasted for 4 years. Started in 2020, right? By 22-23, at least it was resolved in three locations. And it was only in 2024 that the two remaining locations were also resolved at Demchok and Depsang Plains. Now, the big question is, why did China do this? What was the motivation for China to carry out such a big escalation all of a sudden? See, there are no clear-cut answers, but there are different theories which are suggested. One theory suggests that this was China's response to growing relations between US, India, Japan, and Australia. Essentially, it was a response against the Quad to teach India a lesson again, to push India back, and to deter such alliances from taking shape against China. Others believe it was about Xi Jinping's internal power control. It is said that within the Communist Party, especially within the Central Committee and the Politburo, which are the highest decision making bodies, Xi Jinping was reportedly facing a rebellion where rival leaders were coming up to take his seat, and he needed to consolidate his authority, and external wars are a good distraction. So some say it was because of the internal power struggle within the Communist Party. But there are other strategic experts who believe that it is linked with India's aggressive policies with regard to border infrastructure, military modernization, and more importantly, the constitutional change to the status of Ladakh following the abrogation of Article 370 and the reorganization of Jammu and Kashmir. Because with the reorganization of J&K, Ladakh was made into a union territory, bringing it directly under the center's administration. Now, this is where Aksai Chin is located, the most precious region according to China, right? So, with Ladakh coming directly under center's rule, that could alter the status quo as far as the Aksai Chin dispute is concerned. So that could probably be one of the triggers, along with India's improving border infrastructure and military modernization. For example, Indian Army has raised a dedicated mountain warfare unit that specializes in high altitude warfare. And look at the kind of weapons we have procured, from the Rafales to Sukhoi 30, the S-400, and all the American weapon platforms, the P-8 reconnaissance planes, the C-17 and C-130J transport aircrafts, Chinook and Apache helicopters, right? The BrahMos. They've all been forward deployed towards the northern and eastern sectors, be it from Pakistan towards Ladakh western sector to eastern sector. Right? India has pre-positioned and forward deployed the modern arsenal, which directly challenges China's dominance. Plus, India's improving border infrastructure. India has built strategic roads, tunnels, and highways and railway network. Take, for example, the DSDBO road, which is seen as the immediate trigger for the Ladakh crisis. It connects Darbuk near the Shok River with Daulat Beg Oldie, which is a very high altitude location in the Karakoram range. This strategic road, the DSDBO road, was completed by the Border Roads Organization. As you can see, this road runs parallel to LAC. It runs parallel to line of actual control, giving Indian Army better access to the forward positions. So many experts believe that this could be the primary trigger. Right? Overall, India's border infrastructure has improved. We have reactivated advanced landing grounds, which are old World War era airstrips, which are now being reactivated, where Indian Air Force transport planes are landing. Right? Daulat Beg Oldie has one such advanced landing ground right next to the LAC. So India is improving military preparedness, along with the change in Ladakh status as a union territory, could have been probably the trigger. But exact reason, nobody would probably ever know. As I said, researchers, experts, they have proposed many different ideas, right? From close India's ties with Quad countries to a power struggle within the Communist Party to India's improving preparedness and infrastructure and military modernization. Or it could be a combination of all the three. So finally, this standoff was resolved in 2024 during the Kazan summit, the BRICS Kazan summit. Both India and China were anticipating the emergence of Donald Trump for his second term, right? They both had enough experience of dealing with Trump's first presidency, how he had targeted both India and China with tariff wars. So a new realization was coming up, essentially, that India and China should work together, primarily for trade. Even the economic survey in 2024 recommended that India should reopen its trade, especially Chinese investments, which had been stopped after the Ladakh standoff. If you remember, India had brought an indirect ban against Chinese investments, Chinese FDI into India. Chinese apps had been banned on national security grounds. So both India and China have been driven primarily by changing geopolitics, the ongoing conflicts, emergence of Donald Trump, and their own economic necessities to come together and repair the relationship. So at Kazan summit, they finally worked out a settlement through the boundary talks, and they have disengaged, de-escalated, and completely pulled back the troops. Normal patrolling has resumed. They've agreed upon the patrolling points. The patrolling routes have been designated to prevent any unnecessary incursions. And as of now, this arrangement is holding. So parallelly, both sides are stepping up their economic and diplomatic engagement. That explains why PM Modi last year traveled to China to participate in the Tianjin summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So today, the dispute or the standoff which was there at Depsang Plain, at Galwan River Valley, Hot Springs, and Panongso and Demchok, all five flashpoints have been resolved temporarily. And the larger question remains as it is, right? Of course, we are yet to find a final solution. So the special representative talks, which are now being reactivated, is the only way forward. Because see, India China cannot afford a bigger war or a conflict. Two nuclear armed neighbors fighting a bigger conflict is unacceptable. It can cause unacceptable damage to both the sides. So the only way forward is for diplomacy to work. For that, they have to build trust. And primarily, China has to tone down its aggression. China has to live up to its commitments. It has a habit of backstabbing India. In fact, until 2019, the Modi government believed, just like the Nehru government, that China was a good friend of India. Right? If the Nehru government had adopted a naive approach, the Modi government also had reached out in 2018-2019 period, holding back-to-back summits at Wuhan, at Mamlapuram, focusing on trade, economy, and investments, genuinely believing that China can be a good friend, a good partner, only to be backstabbed later. Right? So this is where we need China to respect its commitments, respect international law. That's why India insists that China should follow rules-based order. It should respect and uphold international law. So SR talks are the only way forward to find a permanent solution to the boundary dispute, because it will provide for a political settlement. And until then, we have to manage the relations. We have to manage the tensions which will keep emerging. See, tensions are unavoidable when two large powers are emerging, and when they have standing disputes. It's expected that sometimes it will blow. Uh, it's going to become much bigger than what it is. And India, China have to learn. They have to find a way to navigate those circumstances, not allow emotions to get the better of them. Look at history again, draw lessons, draw inspiration of how India, China have often worked in the past, and that same can be implemented even today. There are so many areas where India, China can actually collaborate, primarily to counter Trump's erratic tariff policies, or to focus on issues like climate change, for example, or trade and connectivity, or handling the current conflicts from Iran war to Gaza to Ukraine. Both sides have a common interest. So we need to find those common areas, build workable relations, and parallelly allow smart diplomacy, silent diplomacy to continue to find a political settlement eventually. So that is it. With this, we have covered the entire history of India China tensions, the whole background, what led to the 1962 war, what were the consequences, and the entire discussion on the current nature of the border issues between the two countries. So, on this note, I bring the session to an end. If you like the discussion, do let me know in the comments. If you found it to be insightful, to be useful for your preparation, please press the like button, share it with other aspirants as well. And tomorrow, join me again at 7 p.m. because tomorrow is another important topic. We will talk about India's wars and conflicts with Pakistan. We'll talk about the 47, 65, and the 71 conflicts, including Kargil and Operation Sindoor. So that is it for today. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.